in terms of, like, for instance, the report on torture was my punishment. We included a bit of background information about these groups where we described their ideological, what ideology they follow when implementing their rule on people. However, we don't, at the end of the day, they are all equally have the same responsibilities. So as Amnesty, we don't differentiate whether they're moderate or extremist, or how we measure their conduct is in relation to how and whether they apply international humanitarian law, which is a heavy word, but in a very simple word, it's the protection of civilians. So this is based on that, and for that reason, in our report, torture was my punishment, but also other reports that we've published previously, we've called on the international community, specifically the countries that were publicly supporting these armed groups, such as the UK, France, the US. We called on them to create a very robust vetting mechanism, which is not enough to just sit with the commander of an armed group. It takes more than that to vet an armed group before providing them with any kind of weapon, lethal or non-lethal type of assistance. So for that, it's very important for this vetting mechanism to start ahead of any kind of support being provided. But when the government or when any state finds out that these groups are committing violation, we have called for these states to end any kind of support. And for us, it's clear that there was a lot of evidence that provides, not only from Amnesty but also from other organizations, that Sultan Murad but others were committing violations, and yet that kind of assistance continued. So it is also on the obligation of the state for them to now investigate and find and hold these groups who are committing these violations accountable. So this is also, these recommendations were part of our report. Regarding on who should be supported, again, we wouldn't say support this group over that group, but we would call for the implementation of a mechanism which is something that has not taken place in the case of the financial support, the non-lethal support provided to Sultan Murad and Jabal Shamia. So we have documented war crimes committed by the YPG in 2015 following a visit that we conducted in northern Syria. And yes, they also have committed violations. So yes, again, our main call would be to vet any kind of armed group before providing them with any kind of support.
Thank you. Mr. Rowan.
Thank you for coming here. In previous session, a picture was painted to us of fluidity concerning the distinction between different battle groups. Not just that battle groups sometimes joined unlikely coalitions, so that members of a battle group could easily move on to other battle groups with completely different approach, different way of working. Is that an image that you can confirm from your own knowledge, and since when did you become aware of such a thing?
Thank you, Mrs. Karabulut.
Thank you so much for all the good work that you're doing in your organization. I think it's very important, especially in the dramatic situation that we have in Syria. I want to continue with the question of Mr. Omtzigt, because about the Sultan Murad Brigade, the Dutch government, our government, writes us that it wasn't actually this brigade who was involved in shooting Sheikh Maqsoud. So they are denying this. How does this match with your reports that this brigade, the Sultan Murad Brigade, was involved and responsible for the attacks that have struck, injured and killed civilians? So this is a very important question, because for the reports about the assaults in Afrin, they are saying, okay, we have knowledge of these reports, but for more information, it's all confidential. So I don't know anything about it. And the second question is, what reactions did you and your organization get from other Western governments supporting the so-called moderate rebel groups in Syria when you pointed out the violations of international laws and all kinds of violation of human rights?
Thank you. Mr. van der Staaij.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Saman, for your view. My question is about the non-lethal assistance program. Do you see any real possibility for such a program in a complicated situation in Syria, where we see that violations of the laws of war, including violations amounting to war crimes, have been committed on all sides of the conflict? And is it then, that's the second question, when you say it's very hard to see any real possibility, is then in fact always the best solution to do nothing? Or who do you see that tension? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sama. And it's time also for me to introduce your neighbor, Mr. Rahman. And he's from Amnesty International in the Netherlands.
Yes.
And helpful in translating the questions.
So yes, I mean, regarding the Sheikh Maqsood and the conduct of the armed groups, I mean, again, the attacks on Sheikh Maqsood were not the first time that we document violations by Sultan Murad. It was before that as well that there were several attacks on government-controlled areas. So I'm just trying to show here that there's a pattern of attacks that were carried out by the armed groups in Eastern Aleppo city specifically. So when it comes to Sheikh Maqsood, I just also want to mention that it wasn't only about the indiscriminate attacks that were carried out, but it was also about Sultan Murad and their allies, which were all part of Fatah Halab coalition, were also obstructing any aid to go into Sheikh Maqsood. They were not allowing any injured to go outside of Sheikh Maqsood. As I mentioned before, we've spoken with many civilians whose homes were destroyed, whose relatives were killed in attacks that targeted their homes. With further investigation, we found out that the reason the method of attacks were indiscriminate shelling, using several types of weapons, including mortars, improvised types of weapons called hamim, like rockets, which are, homemade if you want, and then gas canisters, which is like projectiles where you fit them with literally a gas canister and you shoot it at civilians. We have videos and we have reviewed videos, and this is how we've included the name of Sultan Murad inside of our press release that shows that they mentioned the date, the location, and they mentioned the target, which is Sheikh Maqsood, showing that they were using these types of weapons that cannot be directed at a specific target, which makes them indiscriminate, leading to the death of civilians. So from Amnesty's point of view, it's irrefutable that these armed groups that are part of Fatah Halab have collectively attacked civilians in Sheikh Maqsood areas. This is supported by other also organizations. Now, if you're asking me about the non-lethal assistance, for instance, provided by the government, whether it has contributed to violations, we as Amnesty wouldn't be able to confirm that specifically these kinds of assistance have led to that. This would need further investigation, which the government should be doing. But we can say that there's a big probability that they have used that non-lethal assistance to commit human rights violations. Because as before me have mentioned that there's no difference between lethal and non-lethal. When you fund a group that there's awareness and there's knowledge that they have committed human rights violation, then there's complicity. And for that reason, we are calling on all states to basically follow a very rigorous vetting mechanism, especially in the case of Syria. Relying on the US intelligence is not enough, especially that it was a covert type of operation led by the CIA. So there's a responsibility on the government to do its own investigation and vetting before funding any kind of armed group. As Amnesty, we've never said or asked, we've called on the UN Security Council to impose an arms embargo on the government. but we've never called for an arms embargo on armed opposition groups. But what we've done, we've always, again, made a list of recommendations to states to make sure that any kind of assistance provided to the armed groups is not contributing into violations of international humanitarian law. I mean, I won't be able to say more than that because that would be beyond the remit of our mandate. I'm not sure if I missed any questions. No?
Mr. De Roon had another question,
Yeah,
maybe.
briefly, the question about the fluidity between
Yeah.
the different groups.
The groups.
When did you become aware of that? Could you keep track of what happened?
Yeah, sorry. So the thing is with the armed groups, it's been really complicated to keep track of who is who and who is leading which armed group, which is also one thing that raises concern when it comes to the conduct of these armed groups and the ability to hold perpetrators accountable. Because this is a very important thing that very little has been, said about, which is, who's going to hold Sultan Murad fighters accountable for the violations that they have committed in Sheikh Maqsood and in Afrin now, for instance. So, I mean, we've been receiving violations. I mean, I've joined Amnesty 2014, but I can tell you from 2012 until today, we've received so many allegations of violations by armed groups. And it's not something, I mean, again, the government is still responsible for the vast majority of violations. They've committed crimes against humanity, but we have documented a lot of violations and abuses committed by armed groups. And when it comes to Sheikh Maqsood, we've received them as early as at the end of 2015, but we were able to only investigate in 2016, looking more into what was happening there. As I mentioned before, we've been working on Afrin for also a couple of months, looking more into the violations that were committed before April 2018 and after April 2018.
Thank you. Mr. Baudet.
If you could choose between either the regime of Assad for Syria or the rule of Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, which of the two would you choose? Which of the two would you prefer?
Thank you. Mr. Sjoerdsma.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you also for being here today. You've documented quite extensively the human rights violations committed by Sultan Murad in Afrin. Could you elaborate a little bit on the evidence and the facts that you've provided in those reports, and also since you've mentioned accountability, who do you believe that countries that have provided aid and non-lethal assistance to these groups, such as Sultan Murad, should also be responsible for holding accountable forces, soldiers that committed those crimes? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Ooyek.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Saman. You have been recommending and also been mentioning today the importance of a good vetting process. And you have said this is one of the main recommendations that you have done in your report. Do you have any specific information on how the Dutch program or the Dutch selection process was organized, and could you maybe compare that with how other countries who gave the same type of non-lethal support were vetting and were monitoring the organizations they were supporting?
Thank you. Mr. Saman.
So, I mean, to choose between the government and Al-Nusra, it's not within our mandate. I mean, our mandate is to document violations committed by all parties. I think there's a lot of confusion between ideology, extremism, terrorism, etc., and the protection of civilians. We don't get into the ideology. What we care about is about how are civilians being protected. And it does not justify supporting a group who is not al-Nusra or a country who is not the Syrian government just because of their, I mean, it should be because of the practices of how they're protecting civilians and whether they are protecting civilians. But just to say as well that, I think we always tend to forget that al-Nusra is not the only armed group that's killing civilians unlawfully inside of Syria. There are also other armed groups killing civilians unlawfully, such as the groups part of Fatah Halab who have killed 83 civilians in Sheikh Maqsood. But also we have a lot of documentation of armed groups killing many other civilians in other parts of Syria, such as Eastern Ghouta and others. So I just want to emphasize about that. In terms of accountability, it's definitely, I mean, there is no doubt that armed groups in Syria have a lot of support from big states, such as Turkey, such as the UK, Netherlands, and others. Both lethal, non-lethal, doesn't matter. So they have leverage, they have pressure over these armed groups. And maybe they can't, physically go to Syria and hold these fighters accountable, but it's important that they, comply with their obligation and at least pressure these armed groups that they have committed these violations to hold the fighters and the members of their group accountable to these violations. And we haven't seen that in Syria. If anything, we keep seeing how fighters move across different types of groups, the heads of these armed groups keep on changing. One thing to also mention that also the government has a role to play in relation with Turkey. I mean, if the government is really serious about respecting international humanitarian law, about protecting civilians inside of Syria, it's very important to pressure the Turkish government to at least ensure that armed groups in Afrin are no longer committing these egregious violations against the Syrian Kurds, which is only getting worse. In relation to the vetting process, I mean, as Amnesty, we provide recommendations, and it's up to the government to come up with its vetting process, which is, complies with international standards. It was as far as I've read and I was informed that there was a secret kind of, support to the armed group by the government, so I don't know what the criteria was. But in any way, our role is to ensure that, how violations are being committed, by who, and provide recommendations and ensure that these recommendations are being implemented. And that's why I'm here, urging the government once again to implement these recommendations that we have provided. To compare vetting mechanisms, again, we don't do that. And in any case, we haven't received any kind of response from the states about their vetting mechanisms, including the US and the UK. So we don't know, how they do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mrs. Saman, I was wondering if there's any group in the Syrian conflict which didn't commit violation of human rights, and if so, is it possible for any Western government which says that they respect human values, international human law, to support any group in the Syrian conflict?
Thank you. Mrs. van Kuiken, sorry.
To enhance on the questions that being asked by Mr. Oink and the question that's being asked by Mr. Kuzu, you're stating out that a vetting mechanism should be improved, but then the question is how exactly, and is it possible, relating to the question that Mr. Kuzu is asking.
Thank you. Mr. Saman.
Okay. I mean, again, we call on the end of support or any kind of non-lethal and lethal assistance to the armed groups that we have documented violations being committed by them. There are other international organizations like the COI and Human Rights Watch who have done something similar. I think there's no way that I'll be able to ask your question because I haven't looked into the conduct of every single armed group.